The first slide there is about helping to frame the theological question that I'm looking at. It's to do with the spirit, because in my work with Indigenous peoples, not only in Australia but around the world, obviously the issue of spirits or demons or lots of different names for them are really, really critical. And of course, our focus theologically is on the Holy Spirit, the Great Spirit, the Clean Spirit, the Pure Spirit, and how all those different spirits relate to the Clean Spirit. But so I'm on about revitalising philosophies for living in the spirit of power, love and self-discipline. I put that rather than self-control or even a sound mind. It's obviously a quote from 2 Peter chapter 1. So first of all then, I've got 4 questions there. The next 2 slides ask 2 questions each. In what ways has the vitality of philosophy or philosophies been restricted or lost? Any suggestions? Just a one-word answer even, if you've got any. Otherwise, I'll keep going. Any ways that you think the vitality of philosophy or philosophies in plural has been restricted or lost, either in recent years or over the last 500 years or 1,000 years? Okay. Materialism. Junking spirituality, for example. Yep. Okay. Yeah, that's a pretty central one that I'll be picking up on. Right.
Plurality of philosophies that are present to us.
Yes. Okay. And where's the commonalities between them? Where's the difference, etc.?
We're invited to make comparisons, whereas if we lived in our small villages in Europe 500 years ago, there'd be no invitation to look at a comparison.
Yes. Everybody would have their own particular one. Yep. What might it take to revitalise them? Well, obviously, if we think the spirituality is missing, we need to look at ways of reinvigorating philosophy via spirituality. Thirdly, next question, how are philosophies interwoven with theology in journeys, for us, living in the spirit of power, love and self-control or self-discipline? Of what relevance are Indigenous journeys? Well, in order to understand that, we have to look at what does the word Indigenous mean. And for me, I take the writings of Ward Churchill, who's a fellow in the US. He, like many other people around the world, has had his own indigeneity challenged by some of the Indigenous people throughout the Americas, saying, well, you're not really Indigenous yourself. He claims to be. He claims to have traced his ancestry. But anyway, he's a very strong, vocal spokesperson for Indigenous causes throughout the US. So he says that for him, Indigenous means taking the rights of Indigenous peoples as the highest priority of my political life, drawing upon the traditions, the bodies of knowledge and corresponding codes of value evolved over many thousands of years by native peoples the world over. And that's a stance that I didn't sort of read it in a book once and say, oh, I'd like to do that. Rather, it's been something that's organically grown with me. We've had Indigenous peoples living in my house, people from Doomadgee, since the 1960s, long before the referendum, long before I even knew there was such a thing as a problem between Aboriginal people and non-Aboriginal, because I was just a little kid then. So it's something that I've sort of grown into as I've grown up. Next slide. Churchill goes on to say, Indigenism, or being an Indigenous person, is the basis upon which I both advance critiques of and conceptualise alternatives to the present social, economic, political and philosophical status quo. Being an Indigenous gives shape not only to the sorts of goals and objectives I pursue, but the kinds of strategy and tactics I advocate, the variety of struggles I tend to support, the nature of the alliances I am inclined to enter into, and so on. So on that basis, I do classify myself as Indigenous. Now, some scenarios, just to throw out a few, and these sorts of thoughts come to me all the time. This is to help to invite you into the dialogue. 3 points around the fact that issues of spirit or spirits are central. Soon after I'd started my current job in Bedesert in 2003, I even remember the date, 26th of March, was up there in central Brisbane somewhere, and I got there a little bit early, and I saw all these gubbers, all these migaloos, all these dugeyes, all the different words that we use for non-Indigenous people like me in Bedesert. They were sitting around there talking. They didn't know where I was from or who I worked with, and they're all talking about ghosts, mugais. What is it? Red-haired devils in Malaysia, where my Chinese wife is from. They were talking about all these mugais, and I'm thinking, hang on, I'm supposed to be, that's what we talk about in Bedesert, but you wouldn't expect it to be happening amongst a whole lot of government workers up in Brisbane, but that's what they were doing. Who here has been to the Outlook? Anyone? adventure-based training centre down near Boona. The Outlook's very famous in the youth working world. But anyone who's been there always talks about the Mugais because it's right next to the cemetery. So a lot of people there, whether you're Indigenous or not, they get troubled by the Mugais, the ghosts, at night that come up. So they were talking about that. They were talking about ghosts that experience in Brisbane offices or buildings or homes or whatever. Secondly, the Bedesert Bromelton Bunyip. Anyone heard of the Warrajum? We've got our own, what's the one in Scotland? The Loch Ness Monster? We've got our own one. There's a giant eel with a big hairy mane. There's people have not taken photos of it, but they've drawn pictures of it in newspaper cuttings from the 1950s and before that as well. And the Aboriginal people I know, lots and lots of stories about why the Warrajum is there, what its role is, what its function is. And until a little while ago, I had a huge painting that one of the people in our little close community there had done. It was kept in my lounge for a few months. What about Mount Lindsay? Anyone familiar with Mount Lindsay? I think Mount Barney is the one that's more popularly known. But Mount Lindsay is this one here. Anyone explain what the shape is there? Looks like a cake. But a lot of people debate whether that was naturally formed or whether it was man-made, a bit like the current climate change debate. But anyway, that's down our way. Aboriginal people tend to say that, in fact, is Mount Barney. So if you've climbed Mount Barney, then maybe you've really climbed Mount Lindsay. And this one, which says Mount Lindsay down the bottom, is actually Mount Barney, according to a lot of Aboriginal people. But we could spend the whole of the next 40 minutes to an hour talking about this mountain alone and revolve my entire talk around this. But we won't do that. But that's just one example of what Indigenous political philosophy is about. You can take any particular significant site and you can talk about it day and night. I'll put that down over here. You can have a close look later on and have a look at the shape of it and see what you think of it. The next one I wanted to talk about was I won't waste time looking for it, but I've got it here somewhere. A Bolivian law I saw in the Barnabas Aid Prayer magazine. Bolivian government has recently put out a law saying that all churches and probably other institutions as well have to send in a database of who their people are, where they're from, their names, etc. And they're requiring also that the churches throughout Bolivia build their constitutions and their framework around Indigenous law and tradition and philosophy. And so they're praying against that, saying this is a bad thing. And I'm thinking, well, there may well be good sides to it. Okay, that's a question I leave with us today, and maybe we'll be able to consider that a bit more as we go on through the talk. Okay, going on to the next slide. So questioning modern philosophy is a major root cause of relentless stress. The next 5 or 6 slides I'm quoting at not too great length, but enough for you to get the picture. Voltaire, while I'm talking, you can just be reading that through. I'd rather not just read it straight off the screen. Voltaire lived in when does it say? 1600 and something? 1694 to 1778. And in his book or paper or article, The People of America, can you see there, Robert? You're right? Line of sight? Yep. This is the sort of thing he said. Now, Voltaire, I'm not a philosopher myself. I hated philosophy when I was at university. It was only when I'd come back from overseas and was looking to go into further studies, and I realised that, well, we really need to look at the philosophical underpinnings of Western civilisation and Western culture and Western education if we're going to be able to work for justice with Indigenous peoples. Probably the same for a lot of other topics in society. So this is the sort of thing I came across. This is what Voltaire thought about Negroes or blacks. And if you look on to the next slide, Hume, who followed him very closely, 1711 to 1776, he used these sort of arguments in his pro-slavery arguments and anti-black education propaganda. This one I will read out. He said, this is David Hume, was he Scottish philosopher? Yes. I am apt to suspect the Negroes and in general all the other species of men, for there are 4 or 5 different kinds, he said, very intellectually aware he was, to be naturally inferior to the whites, for there never was a civilised nation of any other complexion than white, nor even any individual eminent either in action or speculation. No ingenious manufactures amongst them, no arts, no sciences. And there's the quote where that's from. Immanuel Kant, who lived at about the same time, who was a German philosopher, I believe. Many of you would have heard of Kantianism or Neo-Kantianism. This is what he said, that Negroes have by nature no feeling that rises above the trifling. And he went on to talk a lot about David Hume and said, Mr. Hume challenges anyone to cite a simple example, should be a simple or single maybe, in which a Negro has shown talents, asserting that among the hundreds of thousands of blacks who are transported elsewhere from their countries, although many of them have been even set free, still not a single one was ever found who presented anything great in art or science, or any other praiseworthy quality, even though among the whites some people continually rise aloft from the lowest rabble and through superior gifts earn respect in the world. So fundamental is the difference between the two races of man, and it appears to be as great in regard to mental capacities as in colour. There's Immanuel Kant for you. There's other quotes that I could go on to, which are quote from, now his name escapes me. I'll think of it. It's in my thesis. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. But modern philosophy's taboos are many. From the time of Plato, how many of you have heard of Parmenides? Anyone heard of Parmenides? One famous quote, which I've quoted at length in my thesis over there, was basically saying you cannot think about or talk about that which is not. You can only talk about that which is. Now, that was really significant in his time because amongst the elite in the Greek society, obviously they did not want anyone to think about the possibility that could be an alternative to the status quo. So that philosophical view, you can only talk about that which is, you cannot even begin to think about that which is not, has really influenced us right down to the present day. I noticed in political discussion in the last few months in Australia, both in relation to the state election and the leadership spill in the federal government, what were the commentators saying? Australian public does not want to do anything, doesn't want to start to think about taking a single step towards reform. So no matter which party you're from, if you start to talk about reform, people back right off and they'll vote for the other party. Right? To me, that's a modern-day example of this. We're afraid of thinking about creating or working towards building an alternative to the status quo. So that's one of the taboos. That's the one about absence. Also, there have been these taboos against thinking being in favour of knowledge, supported from every direction, as it were, by a rejection of the concepts of absence, totality, change, which is linked to absence, but above all, spirituality and a true sense of ourselves. And again, we could talk all night about each one of those absences, or those taboos, but we need to keep moving. So these philosophical taboos permeate modern education and therefore practice in all spheres of life, with resultant crises erupting everywhere, whether in the global west or east, north or south. So against that backdrop, I'm going to talk here about three different strands, a threefold strand. The first one being the transformative philosophy of critical realism. The second strand would be Indigenous political philosophy. And then the third one, not to so much an extent, biblical theology. First of all, has anyone here, by the way, heard of critical realism? One has a little bit. Yeah, a few of you have. I'm not sure what you would have heard about them. Maybe you can ask more questions later on. Over there on the table, there's a very big, thick book, about that thick, called The Dictionary of Critical Realism. When I was doing my PhD, Mervyn, a good mate of mine, he hadn't written that dictionary. So I, like all the other undergrad or postgraduates at the time trying to do a PhD, had to stumble our way through the basic books on critical realism. But Mervyn's come up with this brilliant book called The Dictionary of Critical Realism. So what is critical realism about? Well, it's basically a philosophy of truth oriented to human emancipation. And it's got what they called a holy trinity. It talks about ontological realism, epistemological relativism, and then to work out what's right or wrong or good or bad within the relativity that's there in relation to knowledges, we've got judgmental rationality. So ontology, remember, has to do about being. So we say that, yes, contrary to postmodernists and post-structuralists, there is a reality that can be known. We will never know how much we know, but it can be known, right? There is an ultimate truth, and we can debate rationally, we can judge rationally as to whether a particular statement or event or being or whatever is true. Come right in if you want to take a seat. There are a few more seats around. So moving on to the next one, I want to talk a bit about neo-Nietzschean postmodernism. The Nietzschean legacy of denying the possibility of truth or forgetting. Some of you might have heard the saying about the Nietzschean forgetting. It's basically, can anyone here explain it a bit more, those who might know about Nietzsche? Charles is... Just keep going, okay. Because as I said, I don't have a big background in all of this. My background is in physics, which has got a lot of philosophy in it. Actually, when I was doing the PhD, we did a lot of research on the fact that there's emerging circles around the world in the last 20 years or so, in the case that I came across. And Peter McGrath, is Peter here today? He said he might come, I think. Peter, sorry, what's his other name now? Francis, that's right, Francis McGrath. He had been to one of these gatherings in North America, a gathering between philosophers, Western philosophers, Indigenous linguists and anthropologists and quantum physicists. That's right. There's a very strong interrelationship between quantum physics, spirituality and linguistics. Anyway, maybe more of that later. So I've really delved into philosophy more as it relates to my passion for social justice, working amongst Indigenous and other marginalised groups. So the Nietzschean issue of denying the very possibility of truth is reflected in all of these authors, but it's only minimally referenced by them. People like, you might have heard of some of these, Martin Heidegger, Frantz Fanon, who was died of cancer, basically killed in a sense. He was from the Caribbean, I think, and he grew up mainly in Algeria, and he was a psychiatrist, but he was sort of on the side of the people fighting for independence there in Algeria. Foucault, Edward Said, who died, I think, in 2003. Derrida, those sorts of authors. Now, they're the kind of authors that I dabbled into a little bit when I was at university in the 70s and 80s, and they bored me to tears because I just couldn't see how they related to the real world. And similarly, amongst many Indigenous writers and others, Catherine McConaughey, anyone heard of Catherine McConaughey? Wrote quite an influential book called Rethinking Indigenous Education. A lot of these people who try to propose an alternative to the status quo, they end up being trapped in their theorising, and therefore often in their practice, trapped in this Nietzschean commitment to the denial of the possibility of truth. Now, I want to compare that sort of Nietzschean framework with critical realism. In critical realism, there's this concept of meta-reflexively totalising self-situation. Now, what's that about? In the last 20 or 30 years, there's been a growing commitment to and an interest in subjectivity or objectivity. Which one's been in the rise? Which one's been the most important thing that people want to talk about and be committed to? For example, is there objective truth? How many of you have been to lectures at university or talks in churches where people talk about objective truth? Or do they talk more about the need to be subjective? Subjectivity is held sway, right? So within critical realism, a meta-reflexively totalising self-situation is about reflexively monitoring myself in the depth stratification of my own personality, the outward right through to the inner depths, and in the presence of the past, my ancestry, not only my own ancestry, but that of my extended family, my people, my nation, etc., and the outside, things that are outside me, external. This also enables me to locate myself within the constellational identity of subject and object within subjectivity, which is the level of ontology for those that have done philosophy, within an overarching objectivity. So in other words, in my work, I've found increasingly over the years, even a lot of the Aboriginal friends of mine say, well, Neil, you seem really sort of grounded or centred in a way that a lot of other people they've come across don't seem to be. Now, that may be because of my years working in India, maybe because I've got a Chinese wife. She keeps me grounded. Or my years of work in many diverse places. Anyway, I found this description here of meta-reflexively, etc., to be a good way of describing how I see myself. And for me, it's because I've been able to interweave, by God's grace, the three strands of theology, philosophy, and Indigenous frameworks. Now, also, in relation to Nietzsche's denial of the possibility of truth, I just want to take you on a little journey here and look at that verse in 2 Timothy chapter 1. And I ask you to think about your own situations where you've been challenged by someone else or from within your own thinking to work out, well, is there a basis for truth in this particular statement? We call it in critical realism the truth tetrapolity. Let's look at that verse. For God gave us a spirit who produces not, what? Fear or timidity, but power, love, and self-discipline. First of all, there are 4 or 5 different aspects of truth embedded in that statement by Paul to Timothy. First of all, there's a normative or fiduciary one. In other words, trust me. In making this statement, you can trust me, you can act on it, there's no need to be afraid. Right? And because Timothy knew Paul and trusted him, he trusted him and acted on it. Secondly, that statement is saying that there are evidence and procedures available to us. These are reliable in establishing the existence of a God of this kind. Thirdly, there is indeed a God of that kind, which that is Paul, sentence refers to and expresses. And then fourthly, 2 things, there really is a spirit given to us. We're not kidding. There really is a spirit given to us. And power, love, and self-control or self-discipline are the very nature of that spirit. Okay, moving on to a more general description of critical realism, there are 6 key features. It performs the role of philosophical underlabouring, which the philosopher Locke said so many hundred years ago. For him, underlabouring meant clearing away all the rubbish so that we can start to think and act seriously and sincerely about a particular topic. Secondly, critical realism is committed to seriousness, unlike philosophers like David Hume in particular. It's actionable and practical. Critical realism is an actionable and practical philosophy. It employs immanent critique, which means that in critiquing a particular framework or a particular thread of discussion, it goes deep within that storyline in itself and uses that as a basis for critique against itself. Critical realism examines presuppositions, it enhances reflexivity and transforms practice, and it operates on the Hermetic principle, don't take my word for it, go and test it out for yourself. Okay, moving right along, because I really want to push through these things. I don't want to talk too much about dialectical critical realism unless someone wanted to pick me up on it later. Is anyone here into dialectics? Anyone read a lot of dialectics? One person? Maybe we could have a talk later. But the critique of the Hegelian, that's Hegel again, Hegel's dialectic, which led into Marx, and any form of dialectic after that is very, very strong in Roy Bhaskar's writings, who was the sort of founder of critical realism. He died on the 19th of November last year, just very recently. So I'll leave out that next slide. We'll push on to Indigenous political philosophy. Now, I've handed out to quite a few of you a 2-page document, which is basically an amended extract from my thesis, which talks about Indigenous political philosophy. How would you be if I just read through this quickly? You'll be able to follow it through with me? One reason I'm doing this is to demonstrate that contrary to what Voltaire, Hume and Kant and a lot of the other philosophers since then have said, Indigenous peoples are incredibly highly sophisticated, very acute, very aware of the depth and the stratification of any subject under the sun. And they're able to express it, particularly if they're able to do it in their own language. But I find this in my work in a largely Indigenous team in Bedesert. People there are the same, highly sophisticated, very, very aware of what's going on. So in these next few slides, all these phrases, if you like, have been taken directly from the writings of Indigenous people. Okay, so Indigenous political philosophy arises from the fact that there are continually developing songlines that are manifesting deep Indigenous kinship. Now, as I'm reading through this, I'd like you to think about what parallels you might be aware of within Scripture, within biblical theology, that would seem similar to Indigenous political philosophy. Does the word songlines, for example, mean anything to you? What about the Psalms? Right? And many other examples. I did a lot of teaching on this in India on a couple of different occasions when I was there. So that's another whole topic. Deep Indigenous kinship, obviously that's a theme going from Genesis to Revelation. Now, participation in this kinship is via the imparting of oral history, which is what the whole Bible is framed around, applying an 8-fold matrix, which covers politics, economics, philosophy, spirituality, etc., etc. Strengthening participation in this kinship involves becoming more at one with a complete, complex system of holistic law through languaging in all of life, gifts of the Creator. Becoming more at one with this law is a process of daily responding to situations and circumstances, to holistic reception of sensory confrontations, through instantly positioning oneself in the manifested and the manifesting, becoming committed to government for and by the people through practice of the principle of unity of mind, body and spirit amongst family and clan leaders, being aware of the oneness of the law throughout generations, entailing a social conscious logistic. Social conscience logistics, on the other hand, are given operative meaning by the inference that a basic characteristic of deep Indigenous kinship is a balance between love, spirituality, authority and compliance, and thus oneness of the law accesses the implicit value of being, as political, family-based and interwoven through and beyond a tapestry or field of country and thought through spirit. Now, social conscience logistics have three dynamics. First of all, a reorienting of our attitude towards our cultural personality, our inner self, reorienting one's everyday activity, drawing on the applicability and integrity through the operation of public domain and ontological, theocratic, confidential cultural principles, with implications for a momentum toward expanding activity toward the self-rejuvenation of others, since their trauma and abuse means that your own social fabric is also torn. Just bear with me as I go through this, just one or two more slides on this, because I wanted to apply it specifically to our work in the Bedesert area. And as a result of all of this, solidarity is inevitable. Articulating better understandings and explanations of barriers to realising potential, along with breaking cycles of colonisation policy, therefore requires a non-duality of solidarity within and between cultural groups, emergent from discipline of individual and collective being in entirety, and from respect for life, community, and cosmos in entirety. Moving on to the final set of slides here. I'm re-asking the question there, how do we then, in the light of all of this, nurture solidarity through power, love and self-discipline? And what are some implications for the role of the spirit and spirits in our lives as we do so? My own Indigenous journey has been in the last 20-odd years in the Logan Bedesert area and many other places, including Malaysia, India, and more indirectly in Mozambique since childhood. Now, the next slide, I want to talk a bit more in depth about this. How are we going for time, by the way? Someone got the time there? 5:28. Okay. That's good, because I wanted to start drawing it to a close through these final 4 slides here. And I guess all that comes before this has been laying the groundwork for describing the work that I do. I lived together with Sue Chin and our 2 children in the Woodridge Logan area for 5 years, from 1992 to 97. At Christmas 97, we moved to Bedesert, and we've largely been based there, except for a 2-year stint in Malaysia ever since. That's about 17 years. In that time, I've been increasingly working on what is becoming an integrated approach to youth and community justice, which is what we started with in the Logan area. And if any of you have had experience in that area and want to ask questions or give comments about it later, that would be good. Child protection has been the work that I've centrally been involved in Bedesert since 2003. How I want to illustrate the pages or the PowerPoints that I went through there about Indigenous political philosophy is by describing for you what happened when we got back to work on the 12th of January this year. We didn't know it, but there had been set up for us a whole range of meetings with 6 different agencies. What's happened, you might be aware that in around 2004 there was the Ford inquiry. Some of you involved in social work or child protection would be very familiar with the Ford inquiry, which was actually initiated by a young Aboriginal woman called Sarah Worry, I think, from Bedesert, who along with her foster brothers and sisters had suffered immensely under the child protection system. So that initiated the Ford inquiry. At that time, there were 4,000 children in out-of-home care in Queensland, across the whole of Queensland, of whom 25%, that is about 1,000, were Indigenous. 10 years later, by 2014, the number of children in care had grown to 8,000. So they doubled in 10 years. The percentage of those young children in care who are Indigenous had grown from 25% to 38%. So obviously whatever measures they had implemented over the 10-year period from 2004 to 2014 were not working. And that then led to the Carmody inquiry familiar with the Tim Carmody inquiry? I forget the actual name of the inquiry, but it became known as the Carmody Report that he reported on. So there's a whole lot of recommendations that were given in that inquiry, and some of them were that they need to integrate a lot more closely on the ground family support centres, of which we are one, recognised entities which have to do with forcibly removing children from their own parents if the situation demands it, and a few other aspects of child protection. Now, the Queensland government is throwing buckets of money at this, to the extent that starting from July last year through until December this year, they're rolling out another 20 intensive family support centres across the length and breadth of Queensland to cover the entire state. Associated with those intensive family support centres are what they call Family and Child Connect, which is basically like the community-based intake and referral process, which then feeds into the intensive family supports. Now, these twin programs are being rolled out across the state, but for anyone to apply for this funding, which varies from place to place, in the Beaudesert to Browns Plains area, it's about 1.2 million total, about 600,000 for each of those two programs. But for any organisation to apply for that funding, they have to demonstrate either the history of, or the capacity to, or the commitment to form a strong partnership with Indigenous organisations. So as a result, from the 12th of January, myself and my key colleague, we spent day and night for 3 weeks engaging with, sort of interviewing representatives from 6 different agencies. Some of these you might have heard of. The Benevolent Society, anyone heard of the Benevolent Society, which is one of the longest running institutions in Australia in social welfare. They began, I think, in about 1810 or 11, somewhere. I know they've been going over 200 years. So they're very, very big, and they get bucket loads of money thrown at them. They've got $1.2 million in the Browns Plains Beaudesert area just to run early childhood centres. And they've, in their recent history, have tended to throw a lot of money at different marginalised community groups, which hasn't had the best results. So that was one of them. Another one was a group called Act for Kids. Anyone heard of Act for Kids? Started up by a doctor, I believe, at maybe the Royal Brisbane Hospital, who was seeing so many children coming in, damaged very heavily from child abuse, that he started to set up an organisation called Abused Child Trusts, which then became Act for Kids. So Act for Kids is very, very active across the length and breadth of Queensland, including in the Gold Coast and possibly soon the Beaudesert area. A third one was FSG. Anyone heard of FSG? Called Freedom, Social Justice and Growth. They started up the parents of children with disabilities on the Gold Coast who realised that they weren't getting enough support for their kids, so they formed this small organisation, which has since grown and grown and grown. They now got around 1,000 to 1,200 staff operating in centres from Ballina in northern New South Wales right up to Hervey Bay. So Centrecare was another one, which is a Catholic organisation that does a lot of social work. Another one is Mercy, run by the Sisters for Dignity, I think. Someone might have heard of them. So, and then there was YFS in Logan City, linked up with BoCare, which is in our town. It used to be called the Health and Welfare Association. So these 6 different agencies came to us, and one thing that we learnt from it, we then had to write a letter of support for one or all of them. We chose to write a letter of support for all of them, but each letter of support reflected strongly what we thought of their capacity to work in with us. But one thing I realised that there seems to be a movement, which I would say is a movement of the Spirit of God across the length and breadth of Queensland and potentially throughout Australia. And I think it's global, actually, because as we started researching some of these issues, there was a big forum on in December too, up at Ipswich, on domestic and family violence that I went to. And through such events, I started to look at what's happening around the world, and there seems to be these collectives of people coming together in a way that's unprecedented in my experience, because in my time in working in the Logan area since the 1990s, anyone here familiar with social work or youth work? Yep. What's it like? Is it collective, collaborative, solidarity? Would they describe the work in Logan?
They try very hard, but still silos.
Yeah, still not only silos, but it's... When I was there in the 90s, living and working there, I knew that there were, without naming them, some of the big major money spinners there who had over 100 staff, which was pretty big in those years. They were known to ring up some of the smaller organisations, including church organisations, and literally threaten them over the phone, don't you dare apply for that funding. If you do, we'll come and do something to you. Because we're going for that funding and we're going to wipe everybody else off the map. This is the way their CEOs were talking, not only their people on the street. So for us to witness what seems to be emerging across Queensland, collectives that are genuinely working in solidarity and collaboration in a way that's really working for the good of the most marginalised people is an incredible thing for us. Partnerships with schools. Talking about the absenting of absences as a philosophical framework. Has anyone heard of hidden histories? Anyone here is a teacher in a school? No teachers here? One teacher? Have you heard of hidden histories? No? Okay. It is mandatory, I believe, under the Queensland education system now that every single teacher, not only the teachers but the janitors and everybody working in a school, has to go through this professional development training called hidden histories, which is a particular set of teachings. It's based on what is currently 7 and soon to be 8 different paintings which depict historical periods. Better make sure it's upside down or whatever. There's a whole lot of them here. You're welcome to have a look at them later. But they depict the time since pre-contact in Australian Aboriginal history right through to the present and even into the future. The 8th one will do. So people who are trained in this, and a few of us down our way are going to be doing the training soon, have to come into the schools, train up all the staff in really delving into what I would say is the Indigenous political philosophy, the history and everything that surrounds it. And they have to have local Aboriginal people there, present, telling their yarns, telling their own personal experiences of what's going on. So the partnerships with schools, that's my role actually in the Bethesda area. We work with about 15 schools stretching from Jimboomba, which is about 15 minutes north of Bethesda, down through Bethesda, east to Cedar Creek. We're going to see a small school at Cedar Creek this week, and out through Hillview, Rathdowney, Tumrukum, out as far as Boona and Kalbar. That's the areas that I'm responsible for, and my role, together with an Indigenous assistant facilitator, is to help build partnerships between the parents and other carers and the schools and other education providers. We've also been defunded as of this coming June, but we've put it in an application for funding to be able to continue that. Natural medicine is another example I could give of working within a framework that seeks to integrate Indigenous political philosophy with theology. I brought along here what I carry with me everywhere I go around the world, especially in India, and I know that apart from prayer and really depending on what we had in this little bag, we might not have survived one of our trips. We went to the university in Aurangabad, Suchin and I. I've never seen her so sick, and it was, I believe, again, apart from prayer, it was only the fact that we had our oils, essential oils and herbs and everything with us, that we were able to get through that. So this is another big sphere of thinking and practical action that we're working on down there in our community in Bethesda. The building and construction industry is another one. Towards the end of last year, I took over a business set up by an Aboriginal friend. We're working on it together in the building and construction industry. Anyone here is a builder? No? Anyway, so, well, you won't be able to take back any secrets. But how it operates is that my Aboriginal friend, in dreams and visions, God gives him the picture, the actual dimensions and how it's all to go together of different inventions. He's got about 20 different inventions, some of which we've patented. We've got a wombat wheelbarrow, a koala beam lifter, which can lift up to 800 kilograms, completely overturning the whole workplace health and safety framework. If anyone's ever tried to lift an 800-kilogram beam on your shoulders, which is what they do, and pulleys and cranes and that, and unstable ladders, all that sort of stuff. So, and a butterfly trowel, he's invented that. So with these kinds of inventions, we're hoping to eventually revolutionise the building and construction industry. However, what we constantly come up against is the kind of attitudes towards Aboriginal people that were expressed by Voltaire, Hume and Kant. We see it in the child protection industry. We see it in all of these areas that I've been talking about in the Logan-Bethesda district. We see it in school teachers. We see it just constantly, day after day. And it can be very depressing. I think it must be nearly 22, is it? Right on 22. Okay. The next 3 slides, I won't go into them in great detail, but it talks about backing up the kinds of things I'm saying with my experiences in India, Malaysia, and then less directly in Mozambique. You might have heard of Iris Ministries, Iris Global, based in Mozambique, but stretching now to, I think, 33 other countries. Our daughter spends a lot of time there from time to time. And I've handed out a 2-page letter from Roland and Heidi, which to me is a tremendous blending together of Indigenous political philosophy and theology, miraculous workings of the Spirit of God, encounters with spirits, as spirit beings, across the length and breadth of Mozambique, just to demonstrate the impact of their... Roland would deny it's a theology because, as I said, even though they've both been highly trained in theology, they've both got PhDs, they say when you go to Mozambique, they arrived there a few years after the Civil War finished in 1995. 1992, I think the Civil War finished, and theology had to go out the window. Said, when you're there and you've got abject poverty and tremendous demonic opposition, absolute devastation, just nothing. You're totally dependent upon the Spirit of God and miraculous happening. Their theology had to be reworked, and he describes a lot of that in that 2-page letter that I've handed out. In their first 17 years of work in Indonesia, Hong Kong, and a couple of other places, they saw 3 churches established in 17 years. In the last 12 or 13 years in Mozambique, they've seen through the action of the Spirit of God, they don't really count, they don't keep a close count, but last time they kind of counted, it was 12 or 13,000 that are springing up through the movement of the Spirit of God in that place. So I think I'll leave it there because I'd like to give enough time for questioning, debate, dialogue, or whatever. Thank you. But you can also ask more about issues in Malaysia or India, if you like, in that questioning time. Because I do see, and some of you probably heard stories about similar movements of the Spirit of God working in and through not just people in the churches, but through people, Hindus, Sikhs, Brahmins, Dalits, Adivasis, all of them. There's massive movements of the Spirit of God through countries like Latin America and India and Africa, quite contrary to what Voltaire and Hume and Kant were saying. Yeah. So, any questions?
Towards the end of your section of theory,
yes,
the term non-dualism came up. Can you clarify?
Okay, so what is dualism? Can anyone help us with that? What would you say dualism is?
Particles and waves.
Particles and waves? You see a physics teacher or something there? What's another example of dualism?
Mind-body dualism.
Okay, it's taking them as 2 separate things rather than being potentially integrated. So non-dualism then would be working towards seeing mind and body as interrelated, right? Yeah. Also, non-dualism involves the potentiality for all of us to be really, really connected at a deep spiritual level rather than being separate. So is the Bible, is our theology, does our theology tend to be non-dual or dual? It's a question to ponder. If we follow Greek, how much has our theology been influenced? How has our theology been influenced by Greek philosophy rather than Hebrew thought forms? Would it be true to say that Hebrew thought forms are non-dual, whereas Greek tend to be dual? Is that? Yeah? Okay. Where does Indigenous political philosophy fit into that? Non-dual, yeah. And all other traditional ways of being. Yeah?
Neil, there's a big pressure nowadays for what are called tangible outcomes.
Yes.
How on earth can you mix what you're talking about with what the government actually wants?
Okay, that is a big tussle. The question was, there's a big emphasis in government circles these days to be able to demonstrate tangible outcomes. How do we grapple with that issue in our workplace? It's very interesting that when they set up the 1-year pilot and then the 3-year trial, or I can never remember which is a trial and the pilot anyway, a 1-year thing and then a 3-year thing before they kept giving us all the bungu, all the money, all the cash. we had to demonstrate not only outcomes in 3 areas, I can't remember exactly what they were at the moment, but the fourth one was the non-tangible. We were asked to come up with means of measuring and reporting on changes in cultural healing and cultural strength, which I thought that's very interesting. And that's one of the reasons that was those lines of thinking that fed into my PhD, which is a copy over there. And my thesis is available online as well. And it's about 10 or 12 different pages in my thesis. I talk about our work. But that's the big issue. And there's a lot of workshops being run by all sorts of people around South East Queensland in recent years. They call it, I think, measuring soft outcomes, which is talking about the non-tangibles. Yeah. But we have to come up with, in our child protection work, in our Jimby Centre, which is a family support centre, we have to have 6,000, I think, hours of interaction with clients, which a lot of us hate that word. Was it 6,000 hours and so many clients in that period of time as well. So all those tangible outcomes we have to demonstrate. Yeah, it's a struggle all the time. Yes, Charles?
Neil, you're talking about sort of an Indigenous political philosophy. Are there any signs in terms of the area where you're working about Indigenous theology occurring within Australia or within the area where you're working more specifically?
The question is about signs of Indigenous theology. The leading figure in that in Australia, I believe, would be the Reverend Graham Paulson, who until sometime recently was the first and only Baptist pastor to go through training as an Indigenous person. So he's written a bit on that, and I've got a chapter coming out in a book this year on sustaining spirit across complexities of international development, in which I quote from his paper, in which he combines and compares Indigenous animism with biblical theology. So I've actually got that article here if anyone wanted to have a look. I've got it on a table. I tabulated his comparisons. So there's Graham Paulson, his sons Grant and what's the other son's name? Anyone know the Paulsons? Mark, that's it, Mark Paulson, yep. A few of the sisters there as well. They're sort of leading the way there. Some other people would be Ray Minicon from Sydney. His brother Rod, who I believe might still be in pastoring a church at Zilmia on the north side. He may not be, but I know he was there a few years ago. The Kirks, Graham Paulson's wife is Iris. She was a Kirk, Iris Kirk. Her brother, what's his name? Kirk, who goes around doing all the stuff on talking about natural medicines. No, Kirk, what's his name? Uncle, I can see his face. Anyway, when he comes down our way, he goes out into the yard and collects all the different weeds, so-called, and then he comes and gives us a 3-hour lecture on what all the different medicinal uses of these weeds are. Brilliant stuff. Joey, that's his name, Joey Kirk, Uncle Joey Kirk. He comes to a lot of the Christian gatherings as well. Others you might know of Indigenous theology. I guess up in the Arnhem Land, you've been up there, Neil, haven't you? Yeah. Reverend Jiniini Gondara. And the book Why Warriors Lie Down and Die. It's a brilliant book. It's one of the ones that I used in my thesis. I think for me, coming from many years of work in India and Malaysia and overseas development work, I found Why Warriors Lie Down and Die to be the best approach to cross-cultural work in Australia with Aboriginal people from a whole range of perspectives. Yes.
I wonder if you could just say a little bit about the experience of becoming Indigenous. Is that the word you used?
Indigenous, yes.
Could you say a little bit about just the experience of that for you?
Okay. Well, as I said before, I grew up in my family home when I was a boy. We had quite a few Indigenous people coming down from Doomadgee. Now, I had a few Indigenous mates at school, really only one that I knew of. There were probably others who didn't identify at that stage because the 60s weren't really a good time to identify as an Aboriginal person in Australia. But for us, we're obviously white, or not Indigenous, but the Indigenous people coming down from Doomadgee were obviously Indigenous, black as coal. And yet we all lived there in the same house and went to school together with some of the kids that came and stayed with us. One of the people who came and stayed was Eva Gilbert. She looked after my grandmother till she died in a nursing home at Norton Park. You would know Eddie Gilbert, the cricketer. Heard of Eddie Gilbert, the fast bowler, 1930s? Well, Eva is Eddie's sister, and I believe Eva's still alive up in Doomadgee. Yeah. So for me, it was sort of a natural progression, but the biggest confrontation I found was when I went to India, and I met a few Australians there who started talking to me about Doomadgee, where my uncle and auntie had been Brethren missionaries from the 1950s through for 30-odd years till they were thrown out. Not thrown out by the local people, not thrown out by the government, but thrown out by the church hierarchy, threw them out because they started to listen to the anthropologists, etc., who said it wasn't good to have missionaries working with Aboriginal peoples. So when I went to Bangalore, I can still remember I was at a Labri home in Bangalore in South India, and I came across this Aussie guy who was telling me how terrible it was the way this fellow Alan Hockey, who happens to be my uncle, the way he saw him treating the Aboriginal people in Doomadgee. I knew it wasn't the full story, but I just listened to him. He knew that I was his nephew, by the way. But I soon learnt that for me to come back, when I eventually came back to live and work in Australia, it wasn't the best thing to introduce myself as Neil Hockey with connections to Doomadgee, because Doomadgee was a fairly dirty word at that time. Until I read books like Why Warriors Lie Down and Die, and it started to reinforce the things that my cousins and uncle and auntie had been telling me about life in Doomadgee. But I found that a difficult period, if you like, in the 80s through the 90s, struggling with my identity as a coloniser, basically. That's how I felt I was being labelled. And that's one of the motivating factors for me to write a thesis, as I did, on the potential for and the practical outworking of solidarity. And that's why I came up with that argument for solidarity, as you see on that 2-page handout that I gave. And also arguing for it not just philosophically and theoretically, but in practice on the ground, because I could see all the terrible mistakes that people in child protection, the workers on the ground and the high-up people in the Department of Communities were making. And I realised that they were committing these terrible mistakes of changing the colour scheme, as it were, putting black people in to work in white position jobs and thinking that the problem's solved, when really they haven't changed the system or the culture of the organisation. And it's actually making things worse because everybody's beginning to believe that change is possible when it's not. So anyway, I described them in that 2-page document and more in depth in my thesis. But it has been painful working through this process of grappling with my own identity, my own personal and family history, but also then my identity as a person who has striven to live in solidarity with people from all over the world, particularly in our community in India, then in living in Inala, I lived around the Inala area, then Logan City, and now Bedesert. Most of my friends down there are Aboriginal. They've got all sorts of names for me, most of them complimentary, but they're my family basically. At my 50th birthday, it was a terrible storm. We planned a party. Apart from one or two non-Indigenous friends in the area, it was all my Aboriginal mob friends that came. None of my family came, not because they don't like me, I don't think, but just bad time of the year. I was born on the 10th of December, so no one really likes coming out with all their kids, all the way from the northern side of Brisbane down to Bedesert, for that sort of thing. Yeah, so it's been a struggle, but I'm really grateful to God for all the things that have opened up. Now I've got very deep friendships with Indigenous people from across the globe. There's an Asian regional centre based in, what's the place in Thailand? Chiang Mai, we have about 4,000 missionaries. The Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact, which is an Asian regional group, they're based there. A lot of them are Christians, Indigenous people. And then there's the global one based in Baguio City in the Philippines. Good friends there. They put together a book there, which they gave me when they came and spoke at a conference on food sustainability that I organised in Malaysia. But that's another one I wanted to talk a bit about. We ran out of time. Towards an alternative development paradigm based on Indigenous political philosophy. Fascinating stuff. I'd very much agree with that. Yeah. And it's just been mind-blowing for us in our workplace. We've been struggling there with hardly anyone coming and engaging with us at any deep level for 13 years in the child protection work. And all of a sudden, because of the government being pressurised and therefore putting pressure on organisations around the whole state that they have to work in partnership with Aboriginal peoples, suddenly we find all these massive organisations coming and begging at our doorstep. You know, it's to me a beginning of a real shift. But you'd hear lots of stories that would counteract that as well, which would tend to say that things are worse and are getting worse, you know, and that Aboriginal people are being marginalised more than ever. Depends very much where you are. And I think in relation to that, we need to grapple with something like the critical realist concept of the concrete universal, which very often when you hear arguments being put forward for one thing or another, it'll be taken out of context or they'll only see a part of the whole, etc. The critical realist concept of the concrete universal looks at, for example, human nature as a whole. All humans on the planet have hopefully one head, generally 2 arms and 2 legs, a nose and 2 ears, etc. So that's the universal. But there's at the far end of the spectrum, you've got the particular, the concrete individual, concrete particular, so that every one of us is completely different from the next. Even with identical twins, there are still differences between them. In between that, you've got, say, in a region, particular region, say the people of Brisbane or the people of Beaudesert have lots of things in common. Now, linking the concrete particular with the universal and with the geo-historical place in the middle, you've got all these rhythmics or mediations that lead to what we call in dialectics, diffracting the dialectic. And I'd sometime, if anyone here is interested, I'd love to come and do talks, not because I'm the expert, but because by coming and talking or teaching or engaging and dialoguing, I learn more myself. I'd love to engage along these lines in relation to the question that you asked in particular about these issues anywhere in Brisbane, because this is the first talk I've done in Brisbane on these issues possibly ever. I very rarely get to Brisbane these days, but I love speaking publicly. I speak more when I go to India. I'm run off my feet talking at all sorts of things, and I go overseas for this kind of stimulation and engagement, but I'd love to do it here. And one of the things I think we really need to grapple with here, and that was at the end of my talk there, we must begin to grapple more with integrity with the whole issue of spirits, demons, call them what you might. They are there, they are real beings, and they are disembodied. There are spirits that are embodied in people or things, as there was in the Bible, but there are disembodied spirits. Down our way, we call it getting scruffed up. I've been scruffed up at night. I think a lot of you would have been scruffed up at night. Have you been choked at night by something? How do you explain that medically? How do you explain it spiritually? How do you explain it philosophically? Does anyone know what I'm talking about? Have you been choked at night or feel like someone's sitting on you? With Aboriginal people, they say they've been out camping and they see their mate disappearing out the tent, yelling and screaming. He's not kicking because something's got hold of his feet and there's nothing there, but he's pulled outside and he's really touched up because he's been a bad boy. Yeah, he's done the wrong thing, so he's getting scruffed up. This is how the spirit world operates. And if you read some of the books that I've got there that talk about this in Malaysia as well, it's incredibly deep and it's complex and it's sophisticated and it's related to the Indigenous people's struggle against capitalism and racism in Malaysia or any others of these towns. You know, that's why when they write in that Iris newsletter about Mozambique, they're talking about that stuff, real authentic, if you want to use that word, struggles with the spiritual powers and principalities that in the West we tend to disbelieve in, we discredit that sort of thing. But we have to start facing up to these realities and at the same time grappling with what does it mean for us to be living in or walking by the Spirit. Romans 8 theologically is a chapter that I really want to hold central to in the rest of my life because I think it's so powerful when it talks about the law of the Spirit and Aboriginal concepts of the law, like that painting that you put there on the poster. Chukupar. It's highly, highly complex. It's painted a much better picture too in words in Why Warriors Lie Down and Die. Yeah. Don't know where I'm going with all of that, but these are some of the things that I wanted to try and articulate today, but we ran out of time.
Neil, I might ask you one last question just to sort of wind things up because we might bring things to an end and I'll speak into here so that it strikes me that a lot of what you're kind of getting at is about true reconciliation. It's about the reconciliation not just in some sort of political sense but in a deep spiritual and cultural sense. And it seems to me that within our culture, contemporary Australian culture, there's a kind of dissonance. On the one hand, I think there's a real will to reach out and recognise Indigenous people in Australia and learn from them. But at the same time, I feel like the philosophical tools that we inherit as Western people, they're not really set up to do that at the same time. It's difficult. As I listen to you talk, I feel like kind of two people in a sense, because as a product of my education and my upbringing, there's a sort of skepticism for what we might sort of call metaphysics, I suppose, the spiritual and that sort of thing. I sometimes think, have you ever seen those kind of images where people get sucked into the TV? Sometimes I think what it means to be a Westerner, or particularly my experience, is kind of to have one of those virtual reality headsets kind of stuck on my head, and I know that my philosophical paradigm is limited because I can experience things with other parts of me that don't kind of compute cognitively, at least. If we are all on this journey of reconciliation and truly coming to terms with the other and particularly the Indigenous other in this country, what's one practical thing that we can do to kind of begin to join these hemispheres within our own selves, if that makes sense? How can we begin to overcome the limitations of our own upbringings and particularities to start to take seriously the experience of Indigenous people, for one? So does that question make sense? How can we begin to connect these two realities, as it were? A practical step that we could take.
Okay. Maybe Neil and Marg, are you still there? Maybe you'd like to come in on this one as well because of your experience. But for me, a lot of Aboriginal people say, just go out and do your own research. Read as much as you can. Learn. Educate yourself. Don't come and ask Aboriginal people to tell you stuff. They don't have time for that sort of thing often. But on the other hand, relationships are really, really critical. So seek out, really, really pray for God to open up relationships with Indigenous people in your own area, and just build friendships. Sit down and have a yarn. Get to know them. See what needs they have. See how you can work to support them through those times of crisis. When I first came back from India in '92, not first came back from India because we'd been coming and going for years, but moved into Woodbridge area, I played so many games of football in the parks with little Aboriginal kids and went to so many funerals, a couple of weddings, mainly funerals, and just being there and demonstrating compassion, crying your heart out, laughing with them, just being human with them. And out of that has come some incredibly rich friendships. We got a friend, Suchin and I, Marge Rogers, in Woodridge. She's like a sister to me. I might not have talked to her for 10 years sometimes. You ring her up and it's just like you never left each other. But laugh and gammon, jokes, and just goes on and on and on because you've had that time. I remember going to Marge's mum's funeral with her. Those sorts of real human, down-to-earth sharing of the ups and downs of everyday life. That's where things will grow. Yes, no. Why warriors lie down and die? It's from the ARDS, Aboriginal Resource and Development Services. You can, if you Google them on the internet, you'll find it. Thank you. Oops.
Neil, you've certainly given me a lot to think about this evening, and we'd just like to thank you for coming to share with us. Can we give Neil a round of applause? Thank you. I'm sure Neil would be happy to stick around and answer some questions face to face. So please do that. This is just the first of a series this year in 2015 for Theology on Tap. Next month, you'll see that we've got Irene Alexander coming to talk to us about gender and the divine, so that should be very interesting. Please mark that in your diaries. You can find the details for that in the regular places, so the Theology on Tap Brisbane WordPress on Meetup and on Facebook. But yeah, I'd like to also just thank you all for supporting this event again tonight, and really look forward to meeting some of you in person and hopefully seeing you in the future again. Thanks, everybody. Good night.